Welcome to my 266th video on my work with OO gauge. This video will feature two Trix Wagonmaster kits that I picked up recently on eBay. I will be building and running these wagons, although this is hardly going to be a very sophisticated kit build video, as these turned out to be very rudimentary kits, not really requiring very much in the way of assembly. Here are the two kits as they arrived in their original boxes. They are clearly labelled as construction kits, although I'd say that's rather stretching a point here. I was immediately struck by how light these boxes were, hardly any weight at all. I did wonder at first if I'd accidentally been sent empty boxes. Here are the ends of the boxes. These kits were for private owner open wagons from two different owner companies. The 7/6 on the white stickers would, I assume, have been the original retail price. This would indicate that these kits were originally sold before the UK switched to decimal currency in 1971, something that I'm old enough to remember well. 7 and 6 would equate to 37.5p, although of course the pound had a good deal more purchasing power in those days. My last full-time job in the UK before I emigrated to Canada was in 1974 selling office equipment, and my gross pay was £20 a week. Here are the contents of the two boxes, so not empty after all, nothing missing in fact. The same instruction sheet was included in both kits. Each kit came with its parts fitted into a card base, only 6 parts plus a small bag inside the wagon body with some little pins and screws in it. Here are the parts for one of the kits: a chassis, a body, 2 axles with wheels, 2 couplings, and a bag with screws and pins. Here you can see both sides of the included instruction sheet. Here's the introductory part of the instructions. Note that these kits came with simplex couplings, but the chassis also had mounting columns for tension lock couplings, although these were not included. Here are the instructions related to assembling the chassis. Not particularly accurate to these actual kits. These kits came with screws for the couplings rather than pop-in studs, and they did not include any adhesive bonding strips for attaching the bodies to the chassis. The instructions included special remarks about various different kits identified by kit number, but the numbers of my particular kits were not mentioned at all. Here are the verbal instructions for chassis assembly, very straightforward really, just fitting the couplings and the wheels and then attaching the body. As mentioned, the business about bonding strips didn't apply, although I suppose it's possible such strips were originally included and they got lost somehow. Honestly, there didn't seem to be any need for them. Here's a close-up of the chassis assembly diagram. Note the indication of the columns for fitting triangle couplings. I didn't try, but I think those would also work for the wide Bachmann couplings I tend to fit to kits requiring the addition of tension lock couplings. Here are the pieces still on their card base. Here's the bottom of the base. The parts were basically just pushed through slits in the card. I detached all of the parts from the card base. The chassis came complete as one part, only missing axles, wheels, and couplings. Here are the contents of the little plastic bag. The 2 small screws were presumably for mounting the simplex couplings. The 4 odd little pins would be for attaching tension lock couplings, so I didn't use those. I screwed the little screws into the coupling mounts on the chassis to basically cut their own threads in the plastic. I figured that it would be easier to fit the screws alone first before attempting to actually attach the couplings. Then I removed the screws and screwed them in again through the holes in the couplings. The heads of the screws were only just bigger than the holes in the couplings. I don't see why they didn't use something with a larger head. It was a bit fiddly gauging how to do up the screws. If they were tightened too much, the couplings wouldn't pivot, but if the screws were even a bit loose, since the heads were so small, the couplings would tend to flop out of proper vertical alignment. Next, I just needed to fit the wheels and the wagon bodies. The wheels were metal and the axles had pinpoint ends. No separate bearings were provided. I fitted the ends of the axles into the holes in the axle boxes. The wheels seemed to turn quite freely, but they were rather rusty. I cleaned the wheels with a bronze brush and a rotary tool. As mentioned, no adhesive strips came with my kits, but the bodies had large plastic clips at both ends, which fitted into the chassis. I fitted the body to the chassis using the clips. It took considerable force to get the clips to go into the chassis, and it was rather tricky to apply that force without risking breakage of the small chassis features. I did manage to get the clips all of the way in by pinching hard between finger and thumb, right on the corner of the wagon and the chassis. So there's that first kit assembled, with the only things I didn't use being the little pins. The parts for the second kit were exactly the same, except for the different finish of the body. I fitted the couplings as before. Note that it says on the bottom of the chassis, British Trix, Great Britain. Again, I cleaned the wheels. The axles were also rusty, but I didn't bother about that as I couldn't see how it would affect anything. If anything, it was even harder to get the body clips to go into the chassis on this one. And there are the two wagons assembled. As mentioned, there was very little weight to these kits. This wagon weighed 26 grams, less than an ounce. And this one 25 grams. For comparison, here's one of the Pico Wonderful wagons that I built recently from a kit. This wagon has a metal body and weighed in at 42 grams. And here's an original 00 tin plate wagon with a die-cast chassis weighing in at 65 grams. Here are the Trix Wagonmaster wagons compared with two Pico Wonderful wagons. Pros and cons to both, I suppose. The Pico kits came with plastic wheels, so the metal wheels of the Trix kits were an advantage. The straightforward simplex couplings that came with the Trix kits were definitely more functional than the Magni simplex couplings that came with the Pico kits. See part 265 of this video series for details of my complaints about the Magni simplex couplings. On the other hand, I think the appearance of the bodies of the Pico wagons is probably better. The Trix kits could be improved by carefully picking out some details with paint. Here's a close-up of the bottom of one of the Trix chassis, more detailed than under the Pico wagons, but then the wagons aren't really very likely to be seen upside down. Here's one of the Pico wagons seen from the bottom. Since the Trix wagons were so light, I decided that I would put loads into them and use this process to add some weight. I put a layer of lead shot into the base of each wagon. Then I poured coal over the top of the lead shot. I thoroughly wetted the coal with rubbing alcohol from a pipette. And then I soaked the coal in watered-down white glue. Here are those wagons after the glue dried. With the added load and lead weight, this wagon now weighed 70 grams. And this one 63 grams. I may have overdone the weight a little bit. I coupled the wagons up behind the Stania 262 tank engine that I recently serviced and rebadged, with a Trix brake van bringing up the rear. Here are the wagons in that train. Unfortunately, I just couldn't get the wagons to run properly in this train. They seemed to want to rock and derail as they went over the point at the left end of the layout. I couldn't really tell why. I checked the gauging of the wheels, and it was about 14.1 millimeters, which I would have thought should be okay, and the wheels didn't have large flanges. I ended up coupling the wagons behind a different engine, an N2, which ran a bit more smoothly, and I switched to running the train anti-clockwise rather than clockwise. This train, going in this direction, ran okay. I'm still mystified as to why these wagons don't like going through that one particular point in the other direction. Anyway, I'll finish with a little running video of this train. It isn't half uphill work trying to get these things to run often, and these wagons have something of a tendency to derail as well, although I can't imagine why, because I checked the gauging of the wheels, about 14.1 millimeters, and they don't have particularly big flanges, so I can't see any reason why they should derail, but they have shown some tendency to do so. Oh dear. But what can you do there? They're at least working now in this train behind an N2. In fact, I think that's the horseshoe magnet N2 that I train. Okay, let's try and stop there. That'll do, such as it is. There you go, those two Trix wagons built from Wagonmaster kits, such as they are.